Blackberry. So older listeners of the podcast might remember that before we all used iPhones, there was a type of phone with buttons on it, a QWERTY keypad, much like you might get on a laptop, manufactured by a company called Blackberry, and they had very significant market share. They were part of the arrival of smartphones into our lives.
So 2003, 2004.
Yeah, coming up to 2007 when the iPhone was launched. But they maintained market supremacy for a few years until, beyond that.
It all came tumbling down.
But it all came tumbling down. This is not a spoiler. Anyone who's been even vaguely aware of technology in the last 10 years or so will know that BlackBerry is no longer a factor. The company still exists, but it's owned by different people, and it's been hollowed out. It produces software. So this is a film made by Canadian TV, made by Matt Johnson, who also plays the character of what's his name? The guy with the headband who's kind of irritating.
Doug,
yeah. Who's a big movie fan, and we went to a press conference and we saw him talk, and he's very much like his character. In fact, everyone seems to be very like their character.
Apart from Glenn Howerton, who claims he's a man of peace, and
he's in touch with his feminine side, which I was not totally convinced of. He seemed to have more of a Tom Cruise vibe than anything else. Yeah. But he's there with a ball. He's apparently in a show called It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
I love how you have no awareness of Glenn Howerton. Like, not only is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia extraordinary, but it's also this is talking to someone who's he's not a routine kind of sitcomer, but also one of the great unhinged actors.
Well, hopefully listeners to this show will know who Glenn Howerton is. I don't, but now I do. He plays Jim Silly Balls, who helped to, in the very early days of BlackBerry, helped to finance
and to invigorate, to turn it from this kind of dorm room op into a kind of lean, mean
Silicon
Valley machine. Yeah,
exactly. Although they never went to Silicon Valley, they stayed in Canada.
Waterloo in Canada.
Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, which is very much the geopolitical sideman of America. Canada. I don't want it to mean
the side piece.
I think Canadian masculinity has always been fraught, because a Canadian man, no matter how strong and masculine he is, can never really be American. Sorry.
Michael Stone's corpse is still warmish. That's why you're saying this. The Canadian filmmaker. There are none others.
I just thought that's a funny and obviously ridiculous thought that crosses my mind every so often when I encounter Canadians, that they might experience this form of emasculation and inferiority, which definitely runs through the film. It is the first, films like The Social Network and Steve Jobs, and the other film about Steve Jobs, definitely have their highs and lows, but they, in the context in which they were made, serve as
the difference with those films,
as you said.
But I think the difference with those films is they are not tech stories.
They're stories of human beings.
And of psychosocial drama more than whereas this is primarily a yes, I did call it hagiography, but I think it's also a book. This is one of those kind of pop sociology textbooks that seems to do very well in Waterston. So about the rise and fall.
Losing the Signal, it's called.
Yeah,
the story of BlackBerry.
Yeah, yeah. Out of touch because it didn't get a touch screen properly. And so I think there's a hagiographic element with all of these types of films. This one feels like a smorgasbord and they explicitly made their admiration for The Office clear in the press conference. I think that's a fair reference. It does feel officey, British and then later American, not Canadian series. And I think there are references or similarities, obviously, to things like The Big Short, to The Social Network. It borrows from the language of this particular type of hagiography about tech, which often are broadly conceived as being critiques of capital in a kind of Pikettian sense. But I think...
Can you just briefly describe the way in which Piketti critiques capital as opposed to a Marxist.
I think in a sort of liberal, like the liberal agenda underpinning,
In that it
Piketti.
centers around human behavior needing to change rather than a structure.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe I'm misreading Piketti, but I mean, I more mean like the kind of structure of feeling around Piketti, because his capital was profoundly influential amongst kind of liberal-minded, kind of soft left figures, but not Marxists, I think. Who have a materialist analysis of these things, and it's kind of seen as a sop.
Reformist, not revolutionary.
Yeah, so it's Lutheran rather than Calvinist, I think is probably the way to put it. And I think this film, it's still a kind of it's in like a hagiography, it's a life of a saint. It's laudatory. We're celebrating the amazing technical upheavals they're able to make, the midnight oil that they burn, the ingenuity that's used to turn this, to kind of dominate the market and then to suffer a catastrophic fall. So I don't think the film is really that interested in this film in particular is that interested in interrogating the kind of capital, the materialist context of the smartphone market. Maybe it kind of alludes to it, but it's more. No, and in a way, it's more of just a kind of snappy kind of comedy of manners about a tech company rising and falling. It's not really that invested in the actual kind of social and economic context underpinning it and giving rise to it, which is kind of what I think it thinks it's doing. But
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want a film about. If one is even to make a film about the rise and fall of BlackBerry, I'm not sure one would necessarily want it to be a sort of film about the structures. Maybe it could be. I'd be interested.
I just mean a bit more critical of it's maybe it's unaware of the. I don't know. It's hard to formulate why. It's just it's not. It hasn't got like the critical chops of something like The Big Short, for example. I think it thinks it's being The Big Short, but it's not, because
The Big Short is like a very expensive Now This or Navarra sort of explainer, basically. It's like it's much more didactic. I think what's interesting about so let's compare Steve Jobs' Social Network and this film. They all have this kind of like autistic protagonist. It's the title.
Mike Lazaridis.
It's Mike Lazaridis, who was the sort of kind of tech brains behind BlackBerry, while Balsillie was kind of the entrepreneurial, economic brains behind it. So they needed each other, these two people. Obviously, Steve Jobs was sort of both of those things for Apple, and Mark Zuckerberg as well to an extent. And they are. So in Steve Jobs and the Social Network, the tech entrepreneur is presented as, in their personal life, deeply flawed and disconnected and alienated and cruel, but more or less infallible and mercurial and genius in their professional life. And I think the difference with BlackBerry, and maybe this is a superficial difference, but I suppose the other difference is that BlackBerry shows a downward arc at the end, whereas Facebook may be in decline now, but when Social Network was made, it was very much about Facebook being the most successful website. Yeah. But they even though they do have this scene at the beginning where Mike Lazaridis, like, with his mad perfectionism, takes apart like a little intercom machine and like solves the glitch in it, even though no one really cares. But it just shows how important how perfectionist he is, and this sort of foreshadows his success. You're sort of watching this thinking, okay, because this is happening because this is his character, and it's his character this particular quality in his character that will mean that he wins. But of course, it is also this character, this kind of unawareness, this autism, this like unawareness of like this refusal to acknowledge other aspects, like the SEC calling up all the time, or like the kind of interpersonal dynamics, the fraud that's happening. Or like, the way in which some of his colleagues are just like not up to the job. It's that's his downfall. And so it's a genuinely kind of balanced portrayal of someone having professional strengths and weaknesses, whereas I think the films about the more hagiographic films, I think, of the Social Network and of Steve Jobs are more just working with this professional, personal.
I think there's also a kind of countervailing, or the narrative arc is how he will eventually compromise his perfectionism and his fundamental beliefs in the interests of I guess not so much succeeding, but escaping ruin. So at the end, he finally agrees to have the phones manufactured in China. And this is one of the few times, I suppose, where it kind of does rear its head about the kind of wider political and economic context of smartphone manufacturing, whatever. And in doing that, it kind of breaks his own rule about kind of manufacturing quality. So the phones that are then produced are rubbish. They don't work. It was an order that was, sort of a catastrophic failure. It was their last gasp of Blackberry, and it all came from him having to compromise his fundamental values. So there's a kind of the rise and fall is also the rise and fall of a man in a way, but we're not in the way that, say, Jesse Eisenberg plays Mark Zuckerberg with this frenetic Machiavellian I guess jaggedness in the social network, and we see really that film is about him, and it's about, like you said, this kind of mercurial character. This film is a bit more archetypal in how it treats its characters. You said you have the money man, you have the kind of goofy dude bro nerd, you have the tech kind of obsessive autist. And it at no point does it kind of cast a light into their personal lives. It's purely at the office, and it rushes through a series of kind of time trials, basically. That's how the film is structured. A series of, like, we have to do the X in order to solve problem Y, and they solve that problem, and then there's another bigger hurdle to jump and another hurdle to jump. So it's a series of kind of increasingly pressurized challenges, basically. Sort of like the kind of crystal maze of filmmaking. So I don't think it thinks it's doing great things. I think it's what we'd politely call a romp.
Absolutely.
It's a bit of a joy. I mean, it's fun enough. I mean, but I think in the grand tradition of, like, all the
shadow of Sorkin looms large.
Yeah, it does in a way.
Aaron Sorkin, who wrote Steve Jobs.
I think, but I mean, more so, I think just the shadow of, like, we are now entering a phase where these films are going to start. These kind of autopsies are going to become probably more prominent.
The future of cinema is films about dementia and films about tech entrepreneur or autistic tech.
You'll have your Reddit film, and you'll have your Twitter film, and you'll have your Quora film, and so on.
This was your argument that we will never. We must now aspire all structural film. It will just be all not structural.
Well, the longest
it would be like this is the cinema is now like tech hagiography.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the longest film ever made. Is actually, in theory, a structural film. It's a conceptual piece of conceptual art, which is about a chain of production of I can't actually remember what the object is. It's something like a pair of sunglasses or something. So the film is actually about 3.5 weeks long and follows the whole process from manufacture to packaging, distribution to a warehouse, sale, point of sale. And obviously, I don't know if anyone's seen the whole film. I think it was shown in a kind of like a installation context. It was running in wherever for a few weeks. So that is obviously the example of these kind of procedural tech films in a way. And it's like, I think maybe in some senses it might be the most interesting one, if not it's probably the least engaging. So I think, fundamentally these films. I don't know. This is the new hagiography of the platforms that we have. So instead of having the lives of the saints, we have the lives of the entrepreneurs. Like you said, Sorkin's kind of like done it best and hasn't really been bettered.
Yeah, and that was what sort of made me less enthusiastic about seeing this, although it was quite enjoyable and it was quite televisual, unfortunately. Formally it's basically just like a mockumentary, shaky camera, like nothing particularly extraordinary there. Yeah, the directors made quite a point of saying that they didn't like to do masters. They like to just capture the energy by like being kind of having close shots, shaky close shots all the time, which I don't think there's anything particularly novel about that. There's lots of things that look like that now, mostly TV shows.
So can I say, I wanted to check that I was correct about this. So the longest film ever made is called Logistics from 2012. It's Swedish. It's 51,420 minutes long. So 35 days and 17 hours. That is the longest film ever made, and it was screened in a House of Culture in Stockholm. So that is the
Sweden. They got the money to do this sort of
money to make that 3 weeks.